In early May 1990, a group of 6 mountaineers arrived in the Caucasus for training before their ascent of Mount Elbrus. This stage was crucial for their further plans to conquer the peaks of the Pamirs. The team consisted of experienced climbers, each of whom had already tackled challenging routes multiple times. The group was led by Sergey Levin, respected in the mountaineering community for his resilience and professionalism. The weather on Elbrus in early May was unpredictable. However, the mountaineers were confident in their skills and preparation. They understood that Elbrus, despite its height and difficulty, should not become an insurmountable obstacle for them. Each participant in the ascent was ready for the challenges the mountain might present. The first days of the expedition went according to plan. The group slowly gained altitude, acclimatizing to the thin air and changing conditions. They set up camp at an altitude of 3,500 meters from where they planned to continue the ascent. Every evening, Levin carefully discussed the next day's plan with the team, checking the equipment and the condition of the participants. He was confident that everything was going as it should. On the third day, when the group reached an altitude of 4,500 meters, they encountered another team of climbers who were already descending after a successful ascent. They reported that the weather at the summit was deteriorating and advised caution. However, for Levin's group, this warning did not cause concern. They were well prepared and confident in their abilities. After a short break, the team continued their ascent. The weather remained stable, and the climbers moved confidently. Sergey Levin was focused on the route, monitoring the condition of each participant. The summit lay ahead, but no one could predict the trials the mountain had in store for them. So far, everything was going according to plan, but in the mountains, the situation could change at any moment. Thus began their expedition, which was supposed to be just preparation for greater achievements, but turned into a severe test of survival. After a break at an altitude of 4,500 meters, Levin's group continued the ascent, but after just 40 minutes, the situation changed dramatically. A sudden strong wind arose, quickly escalating to hurricane. Force gusts. Visibility rapidly deteriorated, and snow began to blanket the horizon, turning the surroundings into a solid white shroud. The temperature dropped sharply, and the mountain, which had seemed like just another step on the way to great summits, turned into a deadly trap. Sergey Levin, as an experienced leader, instantly realized the seriousness of the situation. He knew that continuing the ascent in such conditions could lead to tragedy. Levin gave a clear order: stop immediately and start digging a snow cave. The group acted cohesively and quickly, understanding that any delay could cost lives. Each participant got to work. They knew that in such conditions, staying out in the open was impossible. The strong wind could knock them off their feet, and the temperature was dropping by the minute. Levin led the process, controlling the condition of each group member. They all had enough experience to realize that survival was now the main priority. The snow cave that the climbers dug in the deep snow was to become their temporary shelter. It was the only place where they could hide from the fierce elements. Soon, the team finished the work and everyone climbed inside to escape the cold and wind. The cave was cramped, but it protected them from the weather and gave them a chance to wait for the weather to improve. Levin decided to stay in the cave until morning, hoping that the storm would subside. However, the weather continued to worsen, and hopes for a quick improvement were fading. Soon, the climbers realized that their ordeal was just beginning. The mountain was not going to let them go easily. The night in the snow cave was long and tense. Outside the thin walls of the shelter, the wind raged with incredible force, and the temperature continued to plummet. The heavy snowfall continued without interruption, and soon the cave, which had seemed like a salvation, began to fill with heavy air. The climbers, cramped in the narrow space, realized that their situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. At dawn, instead of the expected improvement in the weather, the storm only intensified. Visibility outside the cave remained at zero. The wind howled as if warning of impending doom. Sergey Levin understood that a decision needed to be made. Stay here, risking suffocation in the snow trap, or attempt to descend in such conditions. Nevertheless, every attempt to go outside ended in failure. Snow masses collapsed on the shelter, and attempts to clear the exit from the cave became increasingly difficult. Sergey Forbstein, one of the group members, fell twice during the descent attempt, which indicated serious health problems. Altitude sickness, exacerbated by extreme conditions, began to take its toll. Forbstein's vision deteriorated, and he almost completely lost his sight, making him practically helpless in these conditions. Levin, despite the critical situation, remained calm. He understood that descending now was extremely dangerous, and the likelihood that someone would die in an attempt to get out was high. He decided to return to the cave and wait for further improvements, hoping that the storm would soon subside. In the meantime, the cave, which initially had 2 chambers, began to collapse. One of the chambers caved in, leaving the group in even more cramped conditions. Space became critically limited, and the climbers' strength was waning. Each of them began to show signs of exhaustion and hypothermia. Amid the general despair, some group members began to doubt the correctness of the decision made, but Levin stood firm. He knew that staying together was their only chance for survival. However, in these conditions, even Levin's leadership could not fully contain the growing tension and fear that the mountain would not give them a chance to survive. Throughout the day, despite Levin's efforts to maintain the team's morale, the situation continued to deteriorate. It became increasingly clear that the snow cave was becoming less and less suitable as a shelter. The air inside grew heavier, and each breath became more difficult. The group members began to suffer from a lack of oxygen and general weakness. The snow continued to accumulate, creating the feeling that the cave was about to collapse completely. During one of the attempts to clear the exit from the cave, Levin and Voronin noticed 2 dark silhouettes making their way through the snowstorm. These were 2 Japanese climbers who, as it turned out, also could not continue their descent due to the relentless storm. Levin, understanding that in such conditions it was necessary to stick together, decided to take in the foreigners in his cave. When the Japanese entered the cave, it became clear that their condition was also far from ideal. One of them was on the verge of fainting, and the other could barely stand. They reported that their connection with the base camp had been lost, and they were unsure if they could survive this storm. Levin, despite the obvious worsening situation, tried to remain calm and maintain order inside the cave. However, adding 2 more people to the already cramped shelter made the situation even more challenging. The cave, designed for 6, barely accommodated all 8 people. Nevertheless, Levin understood that leaving anyone outside the cave would be equivalent to a death sentence. He decided to maintain contact with the base through the radio to request assistance. However, the radio worked intermittently, and it was only occasionally possible to establish a stable connection. In the evening, Levin had a brief communication session with the base camp, reporting the situation and scheduling the next contact for the morning. He tried to maintain a calm tone to avoid causing panic among those on the other end of the line. However, at the end of the conversation, he threw in a worrying phrase: "We are counting on the support group." This statement was the first sign that Levin was beginning to realize the gravity of their situation. The Japanese group also tried to maintain contact, but due to the weather conditions, it was almost impossible. Although they reported to their colleagues that everything was fine, Levin understood that the situation was much worse than it seemed. However, he did not ask for immediate help, hoping that the storm would soon subside and they could descend on their own. Night was approaching, and everyone understood that the coming hours would be decisive. The shelter, which had seemed like temporary salvation, began to turn into a trap, and growing uncertainty and fear weighed heavily on everyone, knowing that the storm could last much longer. The night in the snow cave turned out to be even harsher than the previous ones. The group, including the 2 Japanese climbers, was forced to stay in the cramped and stuffy shelter. Each of them felt increasing fatigue and anxiety, which grew with the ongoing storm outside the cave. Levin, though he tried to maintain the team's spirit, increasingly realized that the situation was spiraling out of control. In the morning, as agreed, Levin once again attempted to contact the base camp. However, hopes for better weather were not realized. Visibility remained at 0, and the snowfall continued unabated. The storm raged on, as if unwilling to release them from the summit. Levin tried again to reach the camp to request help, but the radio only partially worked, and Levin's words were interrupted by static. Meanwhile, at the camp below, realizing that Levin's group and the Japanese were in dire straits, a decision was made to send out a small search party. Leonid Ebril, who led the support group, understood that there was no time to waste and that any delay could cost his comrades their lives. They set out on the search, despite the poor weather conditions and the slim hope of success. The search party struggled through the dense fog and snow, but their attempts to find Levin's cave were unsuccessful. The strong wind and limited visibility made it impossible for them to navigate the terrain. After several hours of fruitless searching, Ebril was forced to make the difficult decision to return to camp. The rescuers were exhausted and realized that without clear coordinates and improved weather, finding the lost climbers would be nearly impossible. When Levin learned of the search party's failure, he began to understand that the situation was becoming critical. The cave was growing increasingly cramped, and the air was becoming heavier. Staying there another night meant exposing themselves and others to deadly danger, but the risk of descending in such conditions was also too great. The decision to stay another night in the cave made by Levin was a forced one. The group was exhausted, and no one had the strength for another attempt in such conditions. But everyone understood that this decision could prove to be a fatal mistake. They hoped that by morning the weather would change, and they would be able to attempt a descent without exposing themselves to excessive risk. The approaching night once again brought not only cold and snow, but also deep anxiety. Everyone understood that their chances of survival were rapidly diminishing. There was nothing left to do but hope that morning would bring the long-awaited relief. But within each of them grew the understanding that the mountain was not going to let them go. The night that followed the failed rescue attempt was the hardest for the group of climbers. Everyone knew that the decision to stay in the cave could be their last. Inside the small and cramped shelter, it became almost impossible to breathe. The snow accumulating outside was pressing harder and harder against the cave walls, making the space even more confined. Levin, Lazarev, and Voronin, realizing the critical nature of the situation, decided to go outside and try to dig out the cave. They hoped this would help improve air access and prevent a collapse. The 3 of them bravely ventured out despite the strongest wind and the relentless snowfall. Each step was a struggle, and it was clear that they could not stay outside for long. For several hours, they desperately tried to clear the snowdrifts, but their efforts seemed futile. The storm did not abate, and the snow quickly filled in whatever they managed to clear. Despite all their efforts, the cave continued to succumb to the forces of nature. After attempts to clear the entrance and improve the cave's ventilation, Levin once again reconsidered the option of descending. In conditions of near-zero visibility and strong winds, descending was very risky, but staying in a cave that could collapse at any moment was no less dangerous. However, after weighing all the risks, Levin decided to stay until morning, hoping for an improvement in the weather. Night fell, and the cold penetrated deeper and deeper. The climbers, frozen and exhausted, tried to keep warm in the cave, but the snow continued to cover the entrance. By morning, the situation had reached a critical point. It was practically impossible to breathe, and the air inside the cave was becoming increasingly rarefied. The group members, having lost strength and hope, were slipping into a semi-conscious state. Morning came, but not for everyone. When Odintsov woke up, he realized that complete silence reigned around him. Struggling through the snowdrifts, he discovered that the cave was almost completely buried. Soon he realized that 3 of his comrades, Levin, Lazarev, and Voronin, had not survived the night. Their bodies were found near the entrance. They had likely frozen to death while trying to clear the cave and save the others. 2 other climbers were unconscious, their condition critical. One of the Japanese climbers was missing, likely also not surviving the night, while the other was still conscious, but barely holding on. Odintsov understood that if he did not start the descent immediately, he risked dying just like his comrades. That morning became the moment when hope for salvation became the only motivator for Odintsov, and he, gathering the last of his strength, decided to attempt to descend the mountain, no matter what. Odintsov, barely pulling himself together after the terrible discovery, realized that his only chance for survival was an immediate descent. The weather was still extremely unfavorable. Strong winds, heavy snowfall, and almost zero visibility. But staying in the buried cave, where there was a lack of air and where his comrades had already perished, meant certain death. He had no choice. He gathered the remaining equipment and tried to rouse the surviving climbers, but they were too weak to move. One of the Japanese climbers, also in the cave, remained conscious but was extremely weakened. Odintsov decided to start the descent alone, hoping to meet rescuers who could help the others. The path down was fraught with dangers. The strong wind knocked him off his feet, and icy slopes threatened to plunge him into the abyss. Every step required tremendous effort, and every movement could be his last. Thoughts of the slim chances of reaching the camp filled Odintsov's mind, but the fear of death and the will to survive drove him forward. After some time, as he descended a particularly difficult and slippery section, Odintsov spotted dark figures below. It was a group of rescuers who, despite the harsh conditions, continued their search. They followed the tracks, which were almost completely covered by the blizzard, and did not lose hope of finding the survivors. When they met Odintsov, the rescuers immediately provided him with assistance. He could barely explain where the other group members and the Japanese were located, and then, due to complete exhaustion, lost consciousness. Realizing the severity of the situation, the rescuers immediately set out back to the cave to try to save the remaining climbers. Upon reaching the cave's location, they found the bodies of Levin, Lazarev, and Voronin. 2 other climbers and one of the Japanese were in critical condition, but still showed signs of life. The rescuers began an emergency evacuation, understanding that every minute counted. The descent with the injured was no less dangerous than Odintsov's path, but thanks to the coordinated work of the rescue team and the incredible resilience of those still conscious, several lives were saved. Odintsov and one of the Japanese climbers were the only ones who survived this tragic expedition. The journey back to the camp seemed endless, but when they finally reached safety, there was only one thought in their minds. They had survived, but along with this thought came the realization of the immense loss they had experienced on the merciless slopes of Elbrus.